In 1861, 11 southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. Confederate leaders justified this action by arguing that secession was a lawful exercise of state authority, consistent with the principles of the American founding. Today, we will look at the Confederate political ideology and what constitutional structure related to earlier American governing documents, what was preserved, what was changed, and what those changes reveal about the Confederacy's actual political priorities. To evaluate Confederate claims of constitutional continuity, it is necessary to first establish what the early United States actually stood for politically. The Declaration of Independence, adopted in 1776, articulated several founding principles. It held that governments derive their authority from consent of the governed. It identified life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as natural rights. And it stated in explicit terms that all men are created equal. The Declaration did not establish a system of government, it established a political philosophy, one grounded in natural rights, limited authority, and the conditional nature of governmental power. The first governing documents of the United States was the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781. The Articles created a deliberately weak central government. Each state retained in the document's own language its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Under the Articles, the National Congress had no power to levy taxes, regulate commerce between states, or enforce its own legislation. There was no executive branch and no national judiciary. Legislative decisions required the approval of 9 of 13 states. These structural weaknesses produce significant problems. The national government cannot fund itself, resolve disputes between states, or coordinate an effective response to economic or military challenges. By 1787, the inadequacies of the Articles had become apparent enough that delegates convened in Philadelphia to draft a replacement. The resulting U.S. Constitution established a stronger federal government with 3 branches, a bicameral legislature, expanded powers, including the ability to tax and regulate commerce. It represented a deliberate move away from the extreme decentralization of the Articles. The question of slavery, however, was not resolved. It was managed through a series of compromises: the 3/5 Clause, the prohibition on ending the slave trade before 1808, the fugitive slave provision, but never directly addressed as a moral or political contradiction. The political crisis that led to Confederate secession developed over several decades, centered primarily on disputes about slavery's expansion into new territories and the federal government's obligations to slaveholding states. Following Abraham Lincoln's election in November of 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede. Its Ordinance of Secession, issued in December of 1860, formally declared that the state was dissolving its membership with the Union it had joined in 1788. The accompanying Declaration of Causes made the reasons explicit. South Carolina argued that northern states had failed to uphold their constitutional obligations, specifically by refusing to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and by tolerating abolitionist activity. The ordinance framed secession as a constitutional remedy grounded in the idea that the Union was a compact of sovereign states that could be dissolved when its terms were violated. 10 additional states followed South Carolina out of the Union between January and June of 1861. On February 18, 1861, Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as the President of the Confederate States of America. In his inaugural address, Davis presented secession as a lawful and constitutionally grounded act. He argued that the Union had been formed by sovereign states that retained the right to withdraw, and that the Confederacy represented a continuation of American self-governing principles rather than a departure from them. Davis emphasized limited federal authority and state sovereignty as the defining features of the new government. He framed the Confederate cause in the language of the American Revolution, invoking consent of the governed and resistance to overreach by a distant central power. When Confederate delegates drafted their Constitution in February and March of 1861, they worked primarily from the United States Constitution as their model. The resulting document retained the 3-branch structure of the federal government, a bicameral legislature, a federal system dividing the powers between the central government and the states, and much of the original constitutional language. Legal scholar Allison LaCroix, writing in the University of Chicago's Public Law and Legal Theory series, has documented that Confederate drafters were operating within a well-established tradition of American constitutional thought. They drew on existing United States legal precedents and ongoing debates about federalism that had characterized American constitutional discourse for decades. Several provisions of the Confederate Constitution reflected genuine attempts to reform what is drafters viewed as structural deficiencies in the U.S. system. The Confederate president served a single 6-year term rather than renewable 4-year terms, intended to reduce the influence over electoral politics on executive decision-making. The president was also granted a line-item veto over appropriation bills. Federal spending on internal improvements, roads, canals, and similar infrastructure was restricted, reflecting a narrower conception of federal economic authority. These changes were consistent with the long-standing arguments within the states' rights tradition of American political thought. The most significant departures from the United States Constitution, however, concern slavery. The Confederate Constitution explicitly prohibited both the Confederate government and individual states from passing any law that would deny or impair the right of property in slaves. Unlike the United States Constitution, which addressed slavery indirectly through compromise language, the Confederate document named and protected the institution in direct terms. Additionally, and contrary to the states' rights framework, Confederate leaders publicly emphasized the Confederate Constitution imposed a federal obligation on all member states to enforce slavery and return escaped enslaved persons. States did not have the discretion to limit or regulate slaveholding within their borders. Federal authority was invoked to protect slavery, even as it was restricted in other areas. Before hostilities began, a final effort was made to prevent secession through constitutional negotiation. In February of 1861, delegates from 21 states met in Washington at what became known as the Peace Conference. The conference proposed a series of constitutional amendments designed to address Southern grievances while preserving the Union. These proposals included permanent constitutional protections for slavery in states where it existed, restrictions on federal authority to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia without compensation, and reinforced limitations on congressional power over state-holding states. The failure of the Peace Conference is relevant to evaluating the Confederate justifications for secession. It demonstrates that, at the time Confederate states were withdrawing from the Union, mechanisms for constitutional reform within the existing federal system were still being actively pursued. Secession occurred alongside, not in absence of, formal attempts at compromise. Taken together, the evidence suggests the following conclusions about the relationship between Confederate political ideology and early American governing principles. First, the Confederate Constitution drew substantially from the structure and text of the U.S. Constitution. This reflects a genuine continuity in constitutional form. The Confederate leaders were trained in the same legal and constitutional traditions as their counterparts in the Union, and they were largely reproduced the institutional framework they inherited. Second, and most significantly, the Confederate Constitution departed from early American precedents in ways that directly contradicted the founding ideology Confederate leaders claimed to represent. The Declaration of Independence articulated a principle of universal natural rights and political equality. The Confederate Constitution explicitly negated that principle by constitutionally entrenching racial slavery as a permanent institution. Where the Declaration had stated that all men were created equal, the Confederate order legally defined a class of human beings as property. Furthermore, the Confederate use of federal authority to compel all states to uphold slavery was inconsistent with the states' rights framework. Confederate leaders used this to justify secession. Federal power was rejected when it threatened slavery and invoked when it was protected it. This selective application reveals that states' rights were functioned primarily as a political argument rather than a consistent constitutional principle. Overall, the Confederacy's most consequential constitutional choices represented a departure from, rather than a continuation of, the foundational principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence. By explicitly enshrining slavery in constitutional language and by wielding federal authority to compel its enforcement, the Confederate Constitution formalized a hierarchy of rights that the early American framework had left, at least nominally, unresolved. The historical significance of this distinction lies in what it reveals about the Confederacy's actual political priorities. States' rights, limited government, and constitutional tradition were invoked as justifications. The explicit protection of slavery, however, was the main reason the Confederate states seceded.